Hello, welcome to Ask John. Today with us we have John Kaminsky, Director at the Center for the Study of the American Constitution here at UW-Madison. John, I'd like to start with a question or two from Unit 2 in the We the People curriculum. We have a couple questions from some folks asking about the Philadelphia Convention, specifically the Necessary and Proper Clause or the Supremacy Clause. One question is worded, did any delegates, say like Patrick Henry or others, leave the convention because of the debates over these two clauses?
First of all, I should say that Patrick Henry was not at the Constitutional Convention. He was appointed by the Virginia legislature, but he refused the appointment, so he did not attend. He was a bit skeptical about what they might well be doing at that convention. But there were others who were not so nationalistic oriented, so they had some suspicions once the Constitutional Convention was debating the draft Constitution. They all came with the understanding that there should be amendments to the Articles of Confederation. To be sure, the Confederation Congress needed to be strengthened. Some, however, a very small portion, maybe about 10 delegates or so, were nationalistic oriented and wanted real significant change, get rid of the articles and come up with a new constitution that had a much stronger central government. Once that became obvious, and in fact that was proposed on the very first day of the convention, where they debated on the 29th of May, the Virginia plan called for that kind of radical change. And the very next day, they voted whether that would be the standard that they would use in considering the changes, and they voted yes. There was a statement that this would mean a revolution in favor of a broader, powerful government than what the Congress had anticipated with mere minor changes, let's say, to the Articles of Confederation. And so as time went on, different delegates became upset with what they saw going on. No delegate was completely satisfied with what eventually got into the Constitution. There were some that halfway through, for instance, the two of the three delegates from New York, Robert Yates and John Lansing Jr., left around the 10th of July, thinking that this was going in the wrong direction, and this was not what they wanted, and they left never to return. Other delegates left because of personal reasons. A Connecticut delegate, Oliver Ellsworth, had to go and attend court functions. He was a state judge. George Wythe left, a Virginia delegate, because his wife was severely sick and really on her deathbed, so he left never to return. So there were a variety of reasons why delegates left, but of the 55 delegates, only 42 in essence were there at the end, so 13 had left for various reasons. Some of them would become anti-federalists, others would be strong Federalists. And so those who left had some serious objections, not just to the Necessary and Proper Clause and the Supremacy Clause, but to other things. Elbridge Gerry is perhaps a very good example of this. He was what could be characterized as a Republican, thinking that there should be a small government and the central government should not be that powerful. But with Shays' rebellion in Massachusetts, he thought democracy was a dangerous element. And so he came to the convention and was a strong supporter of a much stronger central government. In fact, he used the phrase that's often quoted, the excesses of democracy. But he had recently been married, and his much younger wife and daughter were staying in New York City because of the danger of illnesses in Philadelphia. And consequently, Elbridge Gerry was writing to his wife almost every other day. And we see this repeated account of how Gerry is getting more and more disenchanted with the convention's draft constitution as it proceeds. Eventually, when they decide to give the central government a great deal of power over the militia, that's the straw that breaks the camel's back with Gary, and he then says, I'm not going to sign this Constitution. And so all of the delegates have an ongoing change of heart about the Constitution as it goes along. Some are happy with the strengthening of the central government. Some are upset with that. And so by the end, however, most of the delegates in attendance will sign the Constitution and become advocates for it.
Let's forward to ratification. Would any of those anti-federalists have seen in the necessary and proper clause or the supremacy clause hints of the declaratory act, which had, as you know, been enacted by Parliament many years earlier? Did they see the link between these?
Yes, obviously, they're in their eyes, in the eyes of the Anti-Federalists, there was a almost direct link between the necessary and proper clause and the Declaratory Act that was passed in 1766 by Parliament on the heels, actually the very next day after the Stamp Act was repealed. Stamp Act was passed in 1765. And the Declaratory Act was supposedly a face-saving device of Parliament. They repealed the Stamp Act, but they then said, almost instantaneously, Parliament has the right to bind Americans in all cases whatsoever. That was one provision of the Declaratory Act. The second provision stated that all the resolutions and acts and petitions of the colonial assemblies were null and void. That Parliament did have this supreme authority over the colonies. And so the Anti-Federalists looked upon the necessary and proper clause, the sweeping clause they often called it, as a reincarnation of the Declaratory Act, giving Congress the power to do whatever it wanted to do. Article 1, Section 8 called for the enumerated powers, but at the end of that section of enumerated powers was the necessary and proper clause. Federalists argued that the necessary and proper clause only limited, I should say severely limited, Congress to the enactment of those enumerated powers. And it might take some corollary type acts that would allow Congress to fully enact the enumerated powers. So they needed that kind of latitude. Anti-Federalists did not buy into that. In fact, they saw that this just opened up the doors for Congress to do anything they wanted to do, and coupled with the necessary and proper clause, it was the supremacy clause that allowed the referee in this matter to be the federal judiciary. And so no matter what Congress did, it was likely that the federal judiciary, through the supremacy clause, would uphold the expansion of the powers of Congress. And the Anti-Federalists just were very untrusting of what Congress might well do. George Mason in the Virginia Convention said, what difference does it make whether our rights are violated by specific references or ambiguities in which the powers will be exercised by Congress? And so the necessary and proper clause was an extremely dangerous provision as far as Anti-Federalists were concerned.
Lastly, some Anti-Federalists were very concerned about the size of the country in this Constitution, how it would mesh or not mesh. What were those concerns, and how did Federalists respond to those concerns?
There's no doubt that the standard operating philosophy at the time was that Republican forms of government were very unstable, and that they might well lead to civil wars and rebellions, and you needed an alternative was monarchy that gave stability. If you had a Republican form of government, the argument was, and this was argued by Montesquieu and Blackstone, and going back to the ancient Greeks as well, Republican forms of government only did well in small territories with a homogeneous group of people. And so once you had a much larger territory like the United States, a Republican form of government was not going to provide a satisfactory means of governing people on the fringes. This is one reason why many of the states ceded the western lands to Congress. Particularly this is true of Virginia. It ceded the territory northwest of the Ohio River in 1781, and then again when that was unacceptable in 1783, and then later on they ceded Kentucky. This wasn't out of altruism on the part of Virginians alone to the other states, altruism. It was a realization that to govern those vast territories on their fringes, they might have to send an army to enforce the Acts of Virginia. And that army presented a danger not only to the residents of those territories, but it might well come back like Caesar came back, crossing the Rubicon, and take away the rights of those residents in Virginia. And so they recognized the viability of a Republican form of government in a small territory. So Anti-Federalists seized upon this and used the arguments, particularly in Blackstone and in Montesquieu, in their arguments in favor of a small territory, which meant that the Constitution, the way it was formulated, creating a consolidated central government over this large territory, would not work. Now, Federalists, they opted for different points of view. James Wilson was really the standard. He gave this argument in a speech, a public speech, on the 6th of October, 1787, in the yard of the State House, Independence Hall, in Philadelphia. And it became really the unofficial Federalist doctrine. He argued that the republics that the Constitution created were the states. These were confederated republics. These were the smaller entities that would have a certain degree of sovereignty over most aspects of governing. Only a few national issues would be handled at the federal level. And so he and Federalists argued that the principles of Blackstone and Montesquieu were indeed in force with the Constitution, but you must look at these republics at the state level. Anti-Federalists said the states would be annihilated from this consolidated federal government. And so there's a complete different point of view. I should mention also that James Madison came up with a new point of view, which historians and political scientists have seized upon. And this was in Madison's Federalist Number 10, in which he argued that the way to ensure freedom and liberty was not through small territorial republican forms of government, but through larger governments, larger spheres. He said expand the sphere, because if you expand the sphere, you expand the number of factions. A faction in the judgment of Madison would be what we would call a special interest group today. And so he said the more of these factions you have, the less likelihood that one faction would get control or that a coalition of factions would have a long life. And so he said that's the way to protect liberty. It was to use the factions. You could not get rid of them and maintain liberty. It would be a violation of liberty to get rid of factions. He argued just as fire could be a dangerous thing. You eliminate oxygen and you stop the fire, but you eliminate oxygen and you eliminate life. And so you cannot eliminate factions, Madison said, and so we must find a way to control them. The way to control them is to have many of them and allow them to compete against each other. And that's what this expanded federal government was going to do. Now, this argument that Madison put forth is used, as I said, today by historians and political scientists as Madison's genius coming up with this. Unfortunately, at the time, nobody bought into this. It wasn't commented upon. No one accepted it. No one denied it. No one said it was good or bad. It just it was dead on arrival, and so no one really took this that seriously. It was James Wilson's point of view that the states would be the operative Confederate republics under this new Constitution.